Hey, Hallie.
Hi, Vanjie.
Trying to stand back a little bit from the computer.
I was hoping that it would hide my video for the duration of this, but it does not seem to want to do that. I think it's okay though.
You thought it would hide your what?
I thought that my video would be defaulted hidden, but I think that because the viewing instructions, I think it should be okay.
Oh, yeah.
Let's see.
Oh,
I'm sorry, I'm typing the email to Father Ariaga.
oh, yeah. So, do I need to tell them to mute themselves, or will they'll be able to do it, or you'll do it?
Um, I believe that I can do that.
And the questions should make the questions in the chat box.
I noticed that we have some people that have joined, and Deep appears to be in the wrong section. Give me a second. I'll send him another email.
Oh, yeah, Hallie, we've got 10 people on already. That's great.
Yes. Deep, I have promoted you to a panelist now, just FYI.
Va a ser en vivo.
Hi, Fatima, how are you?
I'm very good, thank you.
We're so happy that you're on this panel.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here and well, see Deep as well.
Yeah.
Long time no see.
Who's your moderator?
Yes.
I think
Thank you.
we can go ahead and probably get started soon. Professor Abriel.
Are the other panelists already on?
I think they will be joining.
Okay, all right. Well, welcome everyone to this panel on World Refugee Day. We're so delighted that you could join us, and we're so honored that we're able to present such an illustrious panel and moderator to you today. My name is Evangeline Abriel, and I'm a clinical professor of law here at Santa Clara. This panel today is a combined effort between Santa Clara's 3 centers of excellence, the Center for Social Justice, the High Tech Law Institute, and the Center for Global Law and Policy. So before I introduce our wonderful panel, I wanted to take just a couple of minutes to tell you a little bit about those centers because we're very proud of them. And I think, Hallie, can I move the slides? Let's see. Could we?
Yes, it should be allowing you to. It should be allowing you to.
Oh, I think, would you mind moving it for me? Okay, thank you so much. So the first of our centers that I wanted to talk about is the Center for Social Justice and Public Service. This gives our students the opportunity to learn and contribute in a number of ways. So it allows them to get certificates certifying to employers that they have really worked to prepare themselves to practice law in the area of social justice. We also give students the opportunity to provide direct representation or volunteer through the placement program, through our summer public service stipends, and through the number of clinics that are offered where students provide a critical representation to clients under the supervision of Santa Clara faculty. We also recognize excellence through things like the Alexander Prize, which is given to an advocate who's used his or her career to advance the service of justice. And let's see, we'll move on to the next of our centers. Which is the High Tech Law Institute. And the High Tech Law, Santa Clara is recognized Santa Clara is widely recognized as one of the highest law schools in the area of intellectual property. And the High Tech Law Center shows why that's the case. We have a number of programs that allow the students to specialize in this area, including the Entrepreneurs Law Clinic, where they provide direct representation to entrepreneurs in the area, benefiting both the students and the community. The Tech Edge JD program is an innovative program that combines law and business and technology and has intensive individual mentoring for students. Students can also dig into really cutting edge issues through a number of new core programs. And they can also, like the Center for Social Justice, obtain a certificate certifying to employers that they have really prepared themselves in this area. So we'll move on to our third center of excellence, which is the Center for Global Law and Policy. And we like to say that the sun never sets on the Santa Clara summer programs because we have 9 of them around the world. And these programs combine both coursework and externships, which really give our students a chance to get to know the countries that they're in and really expand their global understanding. We also are very fortunate to have exchange programs with a number of the universities around the country, around the world. And we're so pleased that ITESO, the Jesuit University in Guadalajara, Mexico, of which Father Arriaga, who will be speaking today, is rector, we're so happy that that is our latest addition to the exchange programs. We hope that when the students come to us under these semester-long externships, that they gain something from the experience, but we can guarantee that their presence here enriches us and our students and our faculty and our staff in innumerable ways. students that want to practice in international law can also obtain a certificate certifying their preparation in that area. And we have a wonderful international human rights law clinic where they provide important advocacy and representation on human rights issues, both domestic and international. So that's a little bit about our centers of excellence, and the combined effort that we have gone to get this panel on today. And I'll move on to introduce our panel so that we can hear what they have to say. So we're very pleased to have with us three wonderful speakers and a wonderful moderator. Our first speaker is Maite Garcia, who is a senior staff attorney with the Florence Immigrant and Refugee Rights Project in Arizona. She is a highly respected advocate who provides direct representation to people detained by ICE in the ICE detention centers in Arizona. She also has experience working with unaccompanied children who were in the custody of the Office of Refugee Resettlement. And she began her career as a criminal defense lawyer in working in federal and state courts in Florida. She'll tell you a little bit about the Florence Project, but just to preface that, the Florence Project is a leader in the country in terms of both advocacy and representation for immigrants and asylum seekers. And I know that we at Santa Clara draw heavily on the expertise from the Florence Project, so we're so thrilled to have Maite with us today. We also have with us Marianne Kenny, who's an associate professor of law at Murdoch University School of Law in Perth, Western Australia, and where she teaches both doctrinal and clinical courses in the area of migration law, refugee law, and social justice. She also speaks regularly on immigration matters and is a widely recognized expert on both international and Australian refugee law. She was awarded the Sir Ronald Wilson Leadership Award in recognition of her social justice work in 2009. And she has been a member of the Western Australian Law Reform Commission, serving as its chair from 2014 to 2016. And she also has acted as an independent expert advisor to the governments of Australia and Nauru. Then we're just delighted that she has gotten up early on tomorrow to be with us right now. So thank you so much for being here. Then we have Father Luis Arriaga Valenzuela, who is a lawyer and the rector of ITESO, the Jesuit University in Guadalajara, Mexico. Father Arriaga has worked to defend and preserve human rights with a number of organizations, just to name a few, or a couple of them. Those are the Ignatius Loyola Migration and Refugee Association, the Legal Rights Center for the Indigenous in Chiapas, Mexico, and the Center for Justice and International Law in Washington, D.C. He was the director of the Miguel Agustin Pro Juarez Human Rights Center in Mexico City from 2006 to 2011. He publishes widely, and he is the recipient of Loyola Marymount University's Center for Reconciliation and Justice Hidden Heroes Award. And prior to his appointment as rector at ITESO, we were fortunate here at Santa Clara to have Father Arriaga as a chaplain and a human rights scholar with us. So we're just thrilled to have him back with us on this program. And then finally, we also have an illustrious moderator, Professor Deep Gulasekram of Santa Clara. Professor Gulasekram teaches in the areas of constitutional law and immigration and nationality law. He speaks frequently and is the author of the book, The New Immigration Federalism, and also the co-author of the most widely used immigration law textbook in the United States, which is called Immigration and Citizenship Processes and Policy, published by West. He's also the author of numerous articles. In addition to his work as a scholar and a professor, he is the co-founder of World Children's Initiative, Inc., which is a nonprofit organization dedicated to improving health and education infrastructure for children in developing countries around the world. So with that, I will turn it over to Professor Gulasekram. And I think we have facility to take questions. So if you'll enter your questions in the chat box, Hallie Bodie, who I did want to take a minute to thank for pulling everything together, will be monitoring those and forwarding those to the speakers for their response. So over to you, Deep.
Great. Thank you, Vanjie. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. World Refugee Day is on this Saturday. It's June 20th. So we're celebrating it a bit early, 3 days early. And for those of you who don't know, it's a day designated by the UNHCR, the UN Agency for Refugees, to honor refugees from all over the world and the types of obstacles and sacrifices they make in moving around the world, in relocating to places and fleeing from places that they can no longer be in. It is on June 20th. It started in the year 2001 to celebrate the 50th anniversary of, I think, the signing of the Convention on the Status of Refugees, if I'm not incorrect. But that's just a little bit about why we're pulling the panel together. So let me get out of the way and let's start. We'll start with Maite, then Marianne, and then Father Arriaga in that order. If you have questions, as Vanjie said, please enter them in the chat box. Otherwise, I will also be posing questions at the end to each of the panelists. So with that, I'll turn it over to Maite.
We are having some technical difficulties, and we're actually going to turn it over to Father Arriaga in one moment, please.
Okay, great. We will turn it over to Father Arriaga. I wanted to say that the one thing that Vanjie did not say, and maybe the most important introductory statement that we could say about Father Arriaga, is that his office was right across the hall from mine for a few years. And it was definitely a blessing to have that. So good to see you again, Father Arriaga.
Likewise, Deep. So shall I start?
Please do.
Okay, so good afternoon to everyone in Santa Clara University. Good morning in Australia. Good evening to the ITESO community here in Guadalajara, Mexico. I'm honored to participate in today's panel as we share our commitment towards social justice and the cause of refugees and other forcibly displaced people. Before I start, I would like to thank the Center for Social Justice and Public Service, the High Tech Law Institute, the Global Law and Policy Center, and especially Santa Clara University, Santa Clara Law School, as we have been strengthening collaboration among our institutions and opening up exchange opportunities for both our students and faculty. Today, I will provide a general overview of the Jesuit approach to the refugees and other forcibly displaced person issues from the standpoint of the Association of Jesuit Universities in Latin America, AUSJAL. It's a Spanish acronym, and of ITESO, Latin American Jesuit University located here in the Guadalajara. So my participation will address three key aspects. First, I will make a brief reference to Jesuit work with refugees. Then I would like to share some insight of how AUSJAL accompanies and serves refugees in Latin America. And finally, I would like to conclude with an outlook of the future of collaboration with forcibly displaced persons from the standpoint of the universities entrusted to the Society of Jesus in Mexico, Central America, and South America. So let me start saying that since its foundation in the 16th century, the Society of Jesus is distinguished by its international vision and by working at a global scale. Jesuits have been committed to the most pressing challenges of humanity, particularly to accompany, serve, and advocate for the rights of the most disadvantaged. This commitment is framed on three criteria, which classify the social apostolate of the Society of Jesus responses to defend human dignity. First, where there exists the most need. To crystallize the most need, they should do an analysis of places where there exist major injustices. So this is the first criteria. The second one is to obtain the best result possible, where Jesuits can make better use of their time and give more best results. And the third, to facilitate the most universal good that brings about the creation of structural, what we call structural changes that favor a dignified life of the majority. Thus, the dignity of the person was the point of convergence among the Jesuits and those collaborating in their work. For that matter, it was not religion, but ethics that brought about dialogue and aspired to make history in the promotion of justice. Such it is the understanding in the Society's common reflection on Jesuit mission in higher education. This was published in 2002. This implies a dialogue with all stakeholders in society who are committed to establish a national and international order based on laws capable of widening everyone's access and warranting the protection of all human rights. As declared by the Jesuit General Congregation, we have this huge assembly, which is the maximum authority of the Society of Jesus. So we have this like criteria that establish that we have recognized our conscience in critical situations that affects hundreds of millions of people, and that because of that demand a special interest on the part of the Society of Jesus. Such is the situation of refugees all over the world. Therefore, based on the these premises, Father General Pedro Arrupe created the Jesuit Refugee Service in 1980. So this has more than 30 years, almost 40 years, or 40 years actually. Well, JRS is an international organization, it's an international Catholic organization with the mission of accompanying, serving, advocating on behalf of refugees and other forcibly displaced persons. JRS, Jesuit Refugee Service, work expresses the commitment of the Society of Jesus to stand with refugees around the world. JRS programs are currently active in 56 countries, serving refugees and other forcibly displaced persons in conflict zones and detention centers on remote borders and busy cities. The service includes pastoral care and psychological and social support programs in detention centers and refugee camps, and provides humanitarian relief in emergency displacement situation. Education and livelihoods programs provide skills development and opportunities for integration into host communities. We never cease to advocate for the rights of refugees and to articulate the obligation to protect the most vulnerable among us. From a Latin American standpoint, Jesuit universities promote several efforts in order to contribute with the training and advocacy in the service of refugee. So AUSJAL, what is AUSJAL? Is this Association of Jesuit Universities in Latin America. At AUSJAL, we have several groups and networks. Our human rights training program, which was founded in 2013, is based on the collaboration of 11 of the 30 Austral universities, Jesuit universities, including universities in Uruguay, Argentina, Chile, Colombia, Venezuela, Guatemala, Dominican Republic, and 3 Mexican universities in Puebla, Mexico City, and here in Guadalajara. Includes also the collaboration of the Inter-American Institute for Human Rights, the Jesuit Refugee Service in Latin America. So the Jesuit Refugee Service is in different parts of the world, but we have one here in Latin America, and among other international and local-based organizations. One of the strategic contributions is the training of agents who accompany and serve forcibly displaced person in the Amazonian region, where governments and companies are invading their lands in order to overexploit the territory. There is a map, you know, the Amazon is between this area in Brazil, Colombia, Ecuador, and part of Venezuela. That is the big, huge region of the Amazonia. So Austral Human Rights Training Program is based on an interdisciplinary, inclusive, multicultural approach to peace, democracy, and development. It blends distance training with face-to-face workshops and offers 4 complementary certifications. One about access to justice, which is very important because, you know, the rights of the refugees, due process, and all that. The second one is related to citizenship, advocacy, and human rights. The third one is more about education in human rights, which is very important because if you are aware of your rights, you can defend them. That's and human security and human rights. Those are some of the topics that we have been working on. Our program trains a diversity of professionals, vast majority working directly in human rights advocacy on behalf of the most vulnerable populations in the region. These professionals include, for example, lawyers, diplomats, educators, social workers, psychologists, and sociologists. Also doctors, nurses, and public health specialists, architects, administrators, police and military officers, well, clerics, and other religious agents. This is a picture of the 2020 alumni and teacher reunion in the Rafael Andívar University in Guatemala. So we have been, you know, we give the trainings in different universities among Latin Americans. We have trained right now 1,642 alumni from 2003 to 2019. 60% of them are women. And Austral's human rights training program is based on an interdisciplinary, inclusive, multicultural approach to peace, democracy, and all that. So I think that is also important. I would like to mention also, I think that's it. So what is the future of Jesuit collaboration with refugees? So I would like to mention that the foundation of the International Association of Jesuit Universities, the YAHU, in 2018, Santa Clara is part of that network as well. And YAHU is a 200 university global network of networks. So Austral is one of the 6 YAHU regional networks. So at the AJCU, the Association of Jesuit Colleges and Schools in the US, is another regional network besides 4 other networks from Europe, Africa, South Asia, East Asia, and Australia, and Melbourne, for example, Spirituality Center, and all the continents. One of the Yahoo's top priorities is to bring higher education to the marginalized and the disadvantaged through collaboration with groups such as the Jesuit Refugee Service. This cooperation is possible due to high-tech-based blend training programs similar to the AUSHAL Human Rights Program, taking higher ed, for example, from Regis University in Colorado to Afghanistan refugee camps where the Society of Jesus work. So I think this is also very important because, well, I think Santa Clara University is very social justice oriented and can also participate in these global initiatives that we are promoting in our more than 200 universities in the world. So I would like to share an example of the short and long-term configuration of Jesuit collaboration with refugees. I'm referring to the AUSHAL Human Rights Training Program expansion into the Amazonian region with the support of the Pan-Amazonian Ecclesial Network. It's called REPAM in Spanish, La Red Amazónica Eclesial. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. Recently, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights issued a very important report about the Amazonian and the rights of the people who are living there. Also, Campion Hall, we have at Oxford University, the Jesuit, we have a college there that is called Campion Hall. It is a research center on Laudato Si, which is the encyclica of Pope Francis, run by Jesuit theologians in collaboration with an interdisciplinary group of researchers from Oxford universities. And the Jesuit Pan-Amazonian Service, that's another Jesuit network. And some South American Catholic university, most of them are Jesuit universities. So it's a huge, for example of how are we working with refugees in those areas that are very important for the humanity. Risa, so some of the achievements are the report, as I said before, on the human rights situation of the indigenous and tribal peoples on the Pan-Amazonian region of the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights. And for example, this resolution that is recently published, well, it will be presented in July actually, but it's resolution 1/2020, the pandemic and human rights in the Americas. And this international strategic litigation and integral ecology approaches will guide the Amazonian School on Human Rights in the short and long term. I think that's it. Okay, so I think that's my first approach to this. This is the whole, well, it's a very short presentation about all the work that the Society of Jesus and of course the collaborations of many people who are working in the JRS, in AUSHAL, and the Jesuit universities. So thank you very much for this part.
Thank you, Father Arriaga, for that nice overview of the Jesuit approach, especially in Latin America. I think we have resolved some of our technical issues and have our other panelists on board with us as well. I want to apologize in advance if you hear screaming in the background. That's a 7- and 4-year-old running around somewhere back there behind these doors. But let me move on to Maite Garcia. And to give us a perspective on what's happening in the United States and at the border of the United States.
Thank you very much. I just want to first say that everyone's PowerPoint puts me to shame. That is not my forte. So this is a very basic, more than anything, prompt. Do I have control of the PowerPoint or?
Yes, you should have control now.
Great. So thank you for having me. I'm Maite Garcia. I'm a senior attorney with the Florence Immigrant and Refugee Rights Project. We are located in a border state in Arizona. Our offices are Phoenix, Florence, Eloy, and Tucson. And then we do work down at the Nogales, Sonora border through one of our initiatives. So my presentation hopefully will give you a little bit of an overview of asylum law and where we stand today, which unfortunately is a little bit bleak. So I apologize for that at the end of everyone's day. And hopefully give you an overview of what we do. So our mission at the Florence Project is to provide free legal and social services to detained adults and children facing removal proceedings or deportation proceedings in Arizona. We have a number of teams. We divide them up mostly in adult and children. The adult team provides legal orientations inside detention centers, which are very much like prisons. There really isn't much of a distinction in the facility themselves. And we also provide what's called pro se assistance because there is such a large number of individuals detained in Arizona. One of the ways that we deal with the volume is by helping people help themselves. So the part of the adult team, these are just our programs, focuses very much on providing people with forms, with information, and really empowering them on filling out their own applications and representing themselves in court. My team specifically, direct representation, takes cases, and from start to finish, we handle the representation. Then we have our social workers who work in conjunction with us to provide more holistic representation. Keno Border Initiative specifically targets Know Your Rights presentations, pro se assistance, as well as representation at the border in Nogales, Sonora. And that is in conjunction with Keno. They are, I'm sorry, and then finally our mental health team that is mandated under a lawsuit called Franco Gonzalez. Those are individuals that the court has deemed incompetent to represent themselves and is probably as close as we come to a public defender model in the immigration system because there is no right to representation. This is the only thing that sort of mirrors a public defender model, and it does not cover the whole United States, right? This is actually just for the Ninth Circuit. So if somebody were detained, let's say in Florida, that individual would not be a Franco Gonzalez class member and thus would not have the representation from our like a mental health type team public defender model. So basics of asylum law, I think the biggest or one of the biggest confusions come in what's a refugee versus an asylum seeker. So a refugee is somebody who is applying for status outside of the United States. Asylum is somebody who's applying within the United States. And in order to be successful on a claim for asylum, they would have to establish that they are a refugee. And the definition of refugee I put up there for you all, but in essence, they have to establish that they fear returning to their country of origin, and that the reason that they fear returning is because they've suffered persecution, and there's a large umbrella of what falls under persecution, or they fear future persecution, and the reason for the persecution or fear or future fear of persecution is on account of a protected basis, right? So the protected basis that we all are probably most familiar with: race, religion, nationality, and then the more complex one, membership in a particular social group and political opinion. So again, just refugees apply for their status outside, and asylum seekers apply once they have arrived in the United States. An asylum seeker can apply a number of ways. Someone might enter on a tourist visa and then say, upon arriving or upon being in the United States, decide that they fear returning and apply for asylum that way. Some folks arrive at the border. Some folks, and present at the actual port of entry. Other folks may cross the border and then once they're apprehended, seek asylum that way and make their claim. So this is just to give you some perspective, on any given day, there's over 6,000 men, women, and unaccompanied minors detained in Arizona. And the photograph here is actually of one of our detention centers out in Eloy, Arizona. So as you can see, there's not much out there. I don't even know if that cactus is there anymore. But anyway, it's just like in the middle of nowhere. As you can see, it's not a picturesque place, and it looks very much like a prison because that's what it is. We just call it a detention center. So again, people that are detained or facing deportation proceedings do not have a right to counsel. And oftentimes this results in them losing their case. It's the statistics and the numbers of folks that go forward on their own that do not have attorneys. The rates of denials are pretty astounding. Actually, it's well over in the 90% and up. So it is a very, very difficult case to prove an asylum case. It becomes even more difficult when you have language barriers, education barriers, cultural barriers that prohibit you from navigating an incredibly complex area of the law. So I wanted to just spend most of my time really talking about some of the challenges facing asylum seekers today. These are just some, and really what I can kind of just go off the top of my head on but it really changes super rapidly. Like one of the things that's not on here that I would say is a major challenge is COVID, right? Like now there's COVID inside the detention centers, and that is an additional challenge and concern and worry to the folks that are detained there, that are trying to choose between, proceeding with their case and fighting to stay in the United States and being confined to a space that has a virus that is known to kill people. So it is incredibly challenging right now representing individuals in detention for that reason. So I just want to name that. It's not, it's on here, I guess, but it's, I would say that's a very large part of what we're dealing with currently. How that affects individuals presenting at the border, right? They closed the border and they're going to be reopening allegedly in about a week, but that timeline, we have no reason to believe that won't move. Similar to how things have sort of shifted for the Remain in Mexico program, which I'll get into. But I want to mention family separation. That absolutely was a major thing that happened 2 years ago or 2 summers ago. The difference between what happened then and what's happening now is family separation was always a thing. You'll often hear that amongst advocates. It was always a thing. It wasn't happening in the large number and so indiscriminate as it was 2 summers ago. Today, what's happening is you will still have family separations, and what that looks like is typically mother and child might be paroled into the United States, but father would be detained. You might have siblings that are separated. I represent a family right now. Wife is in one detention center, husband is in the other. Brother that traveled with them is with the other brother, but in separate areas of the detention center. So it happens still very frequently and puts a lot of pressure on the individuals, again, as they undergo their case. They travel as a family, but then once they arrive at the border, they're split up. The other half of the clients I just described to you, for example, were actually paroled in. So the other half of the family is paroled and seeking asylum in Atlanta. Video teleconference hearings. We are now, especially with COVID, predominantly conducting hearings telephonically, even when we weren't, and we were allowed to go into safe to go into the detention centers, I should say. We were conducting these hearings over a video, which makes it incredibly difficult. You can imagine you're dealing with cases of folks that are traumatized and are having to tell their story, and they're telling it to a screen. So it feels not different from what I'm doing right now, honestly. And sometimes the interpreter isn't even sitting next to them. The interpreter might be sitting where the judge is. So they're interpreting via the screen. There's technological issues that come up that really break the flow of things. I can tell you as an advocate, I hate it. I feel that it completely guts my ability to really speak and advocate and anticipate kind of what's going on during the hearing, right? A lot of folks that do trial work or do that kind of work really reading the audience becomes very difficult, and that's so much of what we do. So that is definitely a challenge. Rampant due process violations. Absolutely. There's a lot of issues, particularly in the pro se context where attorney's not there, that we might handle the appeal. So after we get the record of what happened during the hearing, we're seeing a lot of times that people are not getting full-fledged hearings, are not being given proper translation, and things of that nature that I think really contribute to the fact that really contribute to the difficulties that they face when they're seeking asylum. Increased detention and longer stays for kids and adults. The last 4 years or so have brought about a number of challenges to custody issues, meaning taking away the right to bond for individuals that are in detention, which inherently means that they are detained for longer. And the longer they're detained, again, they start to make this really difficult choice between, do I remain in a prison or do I take my chances returning to the country that I fear returning to and that I fled in the first place? So that's another challenge. The rapid and sweeping changes to immigration law, it's the ups and downs of what has happened. The administration has made it very clear what their agenda is, and that manifests itself in changes in our laws and proposed regulations and things like that. So most recently, last week was a pretty serious blow, I would say, and scary, even though it hasn't come into effect yet, is that they've put forth 160 pages of proposed changes that in essence gut asylum law as we know it. They want to change the very basis for asking for asylum. They want to change the procedure as it is. I've already described to you something that is incredibly challenging and not providing adequate due process, and they want to actually scale it down even more so that there is less of an opportunity to present your case. So those regulations don't come into effect just yet. They are asking for comment, and there are advocacy groups around the country working to provide comment as to why this is such a terrible idea, or why these are terrible ideas, and how much pain and suffering it could potentially cause. There's the third country transit ban. So this was also a proposed regulation that came to fruition that basically says that individuals who apply for asylum, who presented at the border after July 15th of 2019 are no longer eligible for asylum, unless they qualify for certain exceptions. And those exceptions are in essence that they applied for asylum or relief protection in another country in which they transited and were denied. There's also another exception for victims of trafficking. But it is an incredible blow because individuals that, but for the fact that they entered after July 15th, would have been eligible for asylum, are now only eligible for what's called withholding of removal, which in essence means we're going to give you a removal order, we're just not going to enforce it. And a removal order meaning a deportation order. They're also still eligible for what's called protection or withholding of removal under the Convention Against Torture. But none of those things give you permanent status. So, and they don't give you an ability to work. So you're just in limbo. So we have a number of clients that are affected by this now, and cases that we're appealing. But that I would say is another major barrier to asylum these days. Then there's the Remain in Mexico program, migrant protection program. We call it migrant persecution program around here. But so, and this is the program that a protocol that basically says that if you are from a Spanish speaking country, you are sent back to Mexico to await your asylum hearing. What that looks like is individuals living in shanty towns and shelters at the border, at the respective border cities in Mexico that are implementing MPP, awaiting their day in court where they will present at the border at an ungodly hour, honestly, probably like something like 3, 4 in the morning, wait in line, be processed, searched, placed, in essence, under arrest, to be transported to their hearing, to wait all day, and then be transported back, and then, you know, just sent back into Mexico. This has brought about incredible amounts of violence against migrants. It's brought about individuals giving up and going home because I think, having been to Juarez and seen MPP hearings, what I found to be particularly troubling, or most troubling, is that even though these individuals are very clearly displaced, this is being treated as a released docket case, which means it moves much slower. So in detention, there is an understanding that things move a little bit quicker because the individual is detained and you have their freedom is at stake. Well, in MPP, they're considered released because they're not in a detention center. So they're placed on the release dockets, which span years, right? The individual might go to court today and get set for their next hearing 6 months from now, and their final hearing being from start to finish, probably 2 years from the first date they go to court. So it's very problematic. And meanwhile, they're living in Mexico and being targeted oftentimes. Their only recourse there is to say that they fear being in Mexico and undergo a very, very difficult interview with an asylum officer. The rate of denial is incredibly high on that as well. So typically they get denied and sent right back to Mexico. And then finally, policy and rhetoric aimed at creating xenophobia, right? That's another major challenge. I find oftentimes, although I find it highly annoying, that when things like this proposed change come out, it's not law, but it trickles into the mentality of the adjudicator. It trickles into the mentality of the individuals that are caring for our clients, and it enables them to say, you have no rights here, you know. And so that is, I think, just can't be understated. I think that that's really important, even if it's not written in stone, of the attitude changes and how it affects individuals that, you know, are stakeholders in these cases. Okay, and I will turn it over to the professor.
Great. Thank you, Maite. And before I move on to Marianne, if you click on the Q&A box, there are 2 questions there. One, I think Professor Abriel is going to get to later. One, I think, is directed for you, Maite. So if you want to take a look at that, I'll come back to you afterwards. And if you want to answer that, you can. So let me move now to Professor Kenny. It is, I think, just past 9 a.m. in Australia on Thursday. I hope Thursday is a good day. I'm really looking forward to it. You can tell me if it's good or not. And you're going to give us hopefully a global perspective on this, as well as an Australian perspective. So welcome, Professor Kenny.
Thanks very much, and thanks very much for having me, and it's delightful to see you all, and particularly Vanji, who I've known for a long time. Yes, it is Thursday morning here, and winter in Australia, so it's pouring outside, so hopefully my internet connection doesn't drop out. I just would like to just start with, in Australia we have a tradition of thanking traditional owners when we do presentations, and acknowledging them. So I would just like to begin by acknowledging the Whadjuk Noongar people, who are the traditional owners, the Aboriginal people of my area, and pay my respects to them. Particularly important in this current climate, the sorts of issues that have been arising in the United States has trickled through. Everything trickles through from the United States to Australia, and it's been quite an issue here in terms of treatment of Indigenous people. Okay, so I'm going to give you a very quick overview of some key issues in refugee issues in Australia. I do have a series of photographs that I'm using throughout the presentation, which are from Bharat Ali Batur, who is just last week became an Australian citizen. He is a refugee from Afghanistan who I came into contact when he was displaced, and in Indonesia, and he was actually documented, he's a photographer, journalist, and documented his journey of asylum to Australia. So you can check out his website there. So I like to do a little promotion for him. Do I have control of this? Yes, okay. Oh, sorry. So I'm doing my presentation along the lines of that great movie, The Good, the Bad and the Ugly, because that's, I think, gives a good description of some of the things that are happening in Australia. So I do, you know, often we focus on the negative, but I do want to talk about some of the positives that Australia does do. We do have a strong resettlement program, just like the United States. We do accept refugees from overseas, work with UNHCR to resettle refugees in Australia. So in 2018, those are the latest statistics I could get, we resettled about 13,000 refugees, which is not as many as the United States, not as many as Canada, but we are a smaller country. Our population is about 20 million. So we're second per capita relative to national GDP. So we do have a strong resettlement program, and resettlement services here are very good in terms of providing people with assistance, finding work, English classes, and so on. So that is a good part about what we do. So in terms of the way the asylum system works in Australia, so if we're talking, so we're not talking as Mate talked about before, we resettle people who've already been found to be refugees overseas here, but we do have some people who arrive here and want to claim what we call protection or apply for a protection visa. So we have exactly the same definition of a refugee that you outlined before. So people come and they can claim that they cannot return to their country for one of those 5 reasons. But we also, which is a very good part, or goodish, we do also have complementary protection. So people who claim that they're returned to their country, they've faced torture or the death penalty, and that doesn't have to be linked to one of the convention grounds. So sometimes that can be really important, particularly for cases involving women who are experiencing domestic violence or something like that. Anyone who is refused in the first instance, we have a system where they have a right to review by an independent review panel or administrative appeals tribunal, and it's a full merits review, so they have their case heard again. So, I mean, you must feel like our caseload is extremely small. So Australia received around 25,000 applications for protection last year. And however, only around 11% of those cases are successful. So we don't have a huge rate of success in relation to when we're talking about people who arrive in the community. So they may come on a tourist visa or as a student or a temporary worker and apply for protection. So in some cases, it is clear that people use that process of applying for protection in order to stay a little bit longer. Others are genuine cases, but when we're talking about community cases, only 11% are successful. 25,000 is large for us. It's the largest number we've seen in quite a few years, and there appears to be an upsurge in people applying for protection, particularly from Malaysia and China. In terms of representation in Australia, we used to have a very good system of government-funded lawyers for assisting asylum seekers, but in the last few years that has really dropped away. So people are really reliant on pro bono assistance or work from community legal centres or legal aid. Now, when we're talking, so I've talked briefly there about people who arrive on a visa. It's really difficult to get to Australia. So we don't have any land borders, unlike the United States and other countries. It's very difficult to get here without a visa. We strongly control borders within Australia. We strongly control airports and seaports. In fact, we also send people overseas to monitor people getting onto planes in other countries. So we have anybody who's coming here must have a visa. So it's very difficult to come if you're coming from a high refugee producing country. So we have seen some people arriving here by boat, and my apologies somehow that the graphics on this are not so clear on your end, but it shows that there have been some people who have arrived in Australia by boat. So these are the sorts of boats. There's a picture here of the kind of boats that people come on. This is a picture from Batur of the boat that he was on. So basically people were able to, generally would come to Malaysia or Indonesia. They're able to get visas into those countries, then pay a people smuggler to get onto a boat, which is usually not of great quality. As you can see, they then try to seek to enter Australia by way of this island here, which is very tiny, called Christmas Island, which is an Australian territory. It's very close to Indonesia. It's a very small island. I've been there a few times, and it has a large detention centre on it. So if people arrive by boat, they're intercepted by boat, you can see it's quite away from Australia. They have come to an Australian territory. So people who arrive by boat sounds similar to the United States. They are detained upon arrival and sometimes spend several years in detention, and they were able to apply for protection there. Unlike people who are arriving by plane, the number of people arriving by boat, so we're talking about people coming from Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, and Sri Lanka. And people coming from Sri Lanka may even come directly from Sri Lanka as opposed to transiting through other countries. The acceptance rate of people arriving from those countries was around 90%, 80 to 90%. So these were people who were genuine refugees. But Australia's response to that has been quite bad in terms of the use of mandatory detention and so on. So we did see spikes in arrival around the late 90s, 2001, due to conflicts in the Middle East, and the numbers there were only around 5,000. Now for Australia, we felt like we were swamped, and that was the rhetoric similar to what you've been talking about before of the number of arrivals. And you can see here that in 2013, we suddenly saw an increase in arrival up to about 25,000 in 1 year. And so the government then implemented a policy of taking people who arrived by boat and moving them to other islands. For those that were here, basically they had less rights. So there's around 30,000 people who did arrive here who were assessed, but they're only granted temporary visas and no access to family reunion. And that group of people are still living in Australia. Great mental strain, again, due to impacts of COVID-19, losing employment and so on, and having no access to being able to bring their family here. After 2013, the government implemented a policy to deter boat arrivals by taking people who arrived by boat and then detaining them and sending them to Nauru or Manus Island in Papua New Guinea. There's been about 4,000 people who've been sent to those islands, and people's claims were processed there. And I'm happy to answer questions about that if you have any. And I used to travel to Nauru to see the conditions in detention centres, which were very difficult. Here's a picture. The picture you put up before is very similar. The difficult conditions in detention centres, and we're including families and children in those. The idea was that those people would never be able to come to Australia, and it led to a problem of where do we send them, and the Australian government managed to come to an arrangement with the United States to resettle people who'd been found refugees to the United States. And it's taken a long time since 2012, and most of those people are still going, even during now. Last week, a couple of, about 100 people left to go to the United States. So that's still continuing. But what has really stopped, so I've given you the number of people arriving by boat since 2013, the implementation of these policies of sending people to other islands is one measure. The other really bad measure is interception and turnback. So the Australian government, through a policy called Operation Sovereign Borders with the Navy, and intercepts boats that they understand are trying to make it to Australia, and have actually turned them back. So they've either sent them back to places like Indonesia, or have in fact sent them back to source countries like Sri Lanka. In those cases, what they would do, and I think they adopted a measure that was used in the United States in terms of interception of refugees coming from Haiti, where they would board a vessel and do what they would call some sort of preliminary screening, determining whether or not a person had any claim. Now, unsurprisingly, nobody seems to have sufficient claims. They're then turned around and sent back to their country of origin. And there's been some stories, particularly in Sri Lanka, of people being detained upon arrival. Okay, I think that was my 15 minutes, so I'll hand over to the next speaker.
Great, thank you. So I think there's another question that's in the Q&A. Maybe that's something that Maite can handle as well. So if people have questions, you can start to, you can I think, add them to the Q&A. I wanted to start with a few for the panelists. And let me go in the order in which the panelists were speaking. So let me start with you, Father Arriaga. I'm curious, you were talking about the Jesuit, the Jesuit approach and the Jesuit mission in Latin America. I'm curious, how the Jesuit mission interacts with national law and, nation states, and what the obligation is of the Jesuits with relationship to the nation states and the laws that are there, versus the concept that you were, talking about, human rights, I assume as defined by either a Jesuit ethic or international bodies. And so if you could address that question, that would be great.
Sure, I will be happy to address the question. Remember that all the states, all the governments, they have the right of respect human rights. That means the state must refrain from interfering with or limiting the enjoyment of human rights, what we call in the human rights language like negative obligations. So for example, the government cannot torture a refugee. So that's one. Another international obligation is to respect. The states must take measures, necessary measures to prevent human rights violation, and private individuals or group, what is called a positive obligation, and the right to guarantee human rights. That means that state must adopt, as they were saying, positive measures to facilitate the enjoyment of basic human rights. So as Jesuits, we do believe in international human rights law. And for us, human rights law is a powerful instrument of social transformation. That's why for us in our universities, Santa Clara is a very good example of how they advocate for human rights. I think, for example, in Santa Clara, they have a very strong human rights clinic that advocates as well for human rights around the world. And other projects that are similar, also at Fordham University here in Latin America. So we do believe in advocacy, and we are always advocating. We have an office in Brussels that advocates for human rights of the refugees, among others. And we have another office at Geneva as well that advocates for those kind of rights. So thank you for the question. I think it's very important. And I think we take advantage of being a global Catholic order, religious order. So for us also, the promotion of social justice will be very important in our mission, as part of our mission. Thank you, Professor.
So let me now move to Maite. I'm going to ask you a question, but you actually have 3 separate questions directed at you with regards to specific doctrines and policies by people in the chat box, which you can read. My question for you is not doctrinal or policy related. I'm actually very curious about the story you told about advocates at the border. And in light of all the things that are happening, the sort of the constant deluge of governmental policies by the United States government that on a daily basis present obstacles and challenges to your ability to advocate on behalf of your clientele. So really my question is about morale and motivation and what that's like for you personally doing the work at the border with the detained populations in light of everything that's happening. So if you want to start with that, and then you can get to the nuts and bolts of the questions that are here.
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, it's really difficult. And I think I find myself saying that so often. So I don't think it quite captures how we all feel day in and day out. But like it is very, very difficult, and it definitely takes a toll. I think to do the work, everybody in it is very convicted and very, caring, obviously, and very giving. So I think probably the hardest part for all of us is making sure that we're respecting personal boundaries and trying to give ourselves reprieve and space for family and things that aren't work, so that we can keep doing it, because the hits do keep coming. I take a lot of comfort in that I'm not alone, in that I'm very fortunate to work at an organization that's about 130 deep right now. So I'm not alone. And, in moments of frustration and moments that are difficult, I very much lean on my colleagues, as I think they lean on me to commiserate and to have our moment of silence and our moment of despair, I guess, in something, but then to really pick it up and do the work. Meaning, let's get upset about it, let's scream about it. That's fine in the confines of you and I talking, but channeling that energy to think of solutions and think creatively. But I will not lie to you and tell, absolutely. I actually just said yesterday, this is the hardest it's ever been for me. I'm 8 years into my practice. 4 of them are immigration and the other 4 were criminal defense. And I'm telling you, I don't think I've ever felt this despondent between like the regulation shifts, the COVID. I spent yesterday fielding, calls from family and from clients either saying I have COVID or my family member has COVID inside a detention center that has a skeleton crew, so it's just very, it's very troubling for sure.
Do you want to take a shot at the question, this more specific question?
Sure. So the first one I saw, let me look at this chat box. So the first one I think is asking whether individuals within the United States have constitutional rights in essence, or have, I guess more specifically, can they sue the federal government? They have, yeah, absolutely. The ACLU, there's about 1 million lawsuits ongoing right now. Specific to that case, in terms of bringing to justice, or being able to sue a federal agent for something he did in his official capacity, I think that's sort of a separate question, and I'm not super well versed on Bivens, but I can tell you, yeah, we definitely ourselves, the ACLU, other larger advocacy groups across the country are participants in several lawsuits to try to push the envelope, to push back on programs like MPP, to push back on the third country transit ban, and the violations of due process that all of that creates. I'm not sure if that answers Mr. Pope's question. And then in terms of how the US can enforce MPP, Ms. Santiago, we agree. I think it's illegal, but the Supreme Court does not agree with me. They recently upheld the MPP program. So, and I would not be able to answer what Mexico can do specifically. I know that they're under a lot of pressure, and perhaps that's a better question for Father in terms of what he knows they're capable of doing or not doing. I know that there's been a lot of pressure from the United States on this issue. And they have a large economic interest, obviously, in not alienating the United States. So I can imagine that plays into it. And bias against Spanish-speaking refugees, yes, absolutely. I think that is something that comes to play here, because the individuals are because Mexico is a Spanish-speaking country, it really is that pedestrian. Like to them, it's like, sure, just live in Mexico, that you speak the same language, like this will work, right? I wish it was more well thought out. It isn't. And oftentimes when you see these things, like I can't stress that enough, it is not thought out. Like, let's all just acknowledge that these things are not thought out. They're implemented, and whatever happens afterwards, we deal with in the courts. You know, so that's I think to that. And then I'm seeing a question. Do you anticipate seeing detained children or children born in detention that are coming into contact with the child welfare system, being detained and placed in foster care? So, okay, yes, that does. That can happen. Typically, when children are detained in Office of Refugee custody in the United States, they are not they're not just immediately transferred to foster care. That typically happens, or they end up in the foster care system if there is nobody willing to take them in the United States that's family. So Office of Refugee Resettlement is mandated under the current safeguards for children, for unaccompanied minors, to release the children to family in the United States. And oftentimes they do, even though they may not have their parents in the United States, they might have an uncle, an aunt, or a close family member. They are required to kind of vet out that sponsorship before going the foster care route. And in terms of what folks can do to support, I would say do pro bono work. Definitely. I know, Banji, you guys have been super active in taking some cases, and so we have a pretty robust pro bono program for both kids and adults. So because the question was about kids, absolutely. Our kids work specifically, I think, would be most beneficial for individuals in Arizona, because it requires a state court component where you have to go in and ask the state court, right, the dependency courts, to adjudicate the child as dependent. But yeah, I would say if we can always use more lawyers. So definitely pro bono.
Great, thank you, Mente. Let me go to Professor Kenny. There's a question actually in the Q&A box about climate change and the issue of refugees that you might be able to provide some perspective on. And so I want to have you get to that. I also want to just ask you, one of the things that struck me in your slides was the figure of the grant rate for refugee status in Australia from particular countries. And I don't remember what they were, but I think it was Afghanistan and Sri Lanka. And I'm curious if you would first just sort of speak to that and elaborate on what accounts for that extraordinarily high grant rate, and what are the factors that might influence that, and then maybe after that get to the question of maybe in Australia specifically how questions of climate change might play. And I'm curious to see if you see people from the Maldives and other places for whom climate change is a serious and immediate concern in terms of everyday existence.
Yeah, okay, on the first question in terms of grant rates, as you can see that when we're looking at the grant rates of people arriving here and then applying in the community, they're rather low. But you have to dig down into those statistics a bit more to see, well, what countries are they coming from? So there are certain profiles, people coming from certain countries, where country information is showing, that there are serious issues in those countries of origin. So, but the difficulty is, if we're looking at the countries of origin where you do have the highest grant rates, if we're talking about countries like Iran or even Sri Lanka, although the grant rate for Sri Lanka is dropping, it's very difficult for those people to come to Australia on a visa, because we have a very strict visa system, and it's very difficult to enter our country if you are coming from countries of high rate of asylum. So it's very difficult to come what we would, our government would term lawfully. So their only other option is to try to come by alternative means, say by boat, but that has been effectively cut off due to the interceptions and turnbacks. So for those countries, you know, so for boat arrivals, so the irony being that we have this terrible rhetoric around people who don't come in an authorised way. However, we know that it's lawful to seek asylum. At international law, it's a basic human right, and we are seeing that those people who do come in that way, generally their rates of acceptance are quite high, as opposed to those who are coming lawfully and then applying here. And as I said, there are some who do have agents or people in the community who are helping them to apply for protection, because it enables a person, once they apply, to stay in the country and to perhaps work for a longer period of time. So sometimes it is used as that mechanism. So in terms of climate change affecting the issue of refugees and refugee law, I mean, that's a really great question. And I'm not sure, I'm gathering that you guys study refugee law by the, you know, looking at your questions are really sophisticated. So you would know that the Refugee Convention was drafted in 1954, was not anticipating people being displaced due to climate change. So trying to shoehorn yourself into one of those 5 grounds is very difficult. But we are going to see, yes, in Australia, you know, there has been discussions, I think, around, we do have sort of a process of talking to countries in the ASEAN region around and the Pacific region, because those Pacific islands, and I've been to Nauru, and you can see how vulnerable it is to rising sea levels. People will be displaced as a result of that. But unfortunately, I don't see a great deal of cooperation on what will happen with people who are displaced like that. Perhaps they won't use the refugee route or humanitarian route, and maybe they'll try using other forms of trying to migrate here, say temporary worker schemes and those sorts of things. New Zealand actually is much nicer. If you want to look at an ideal country for refugee law, go to New Zealand. I mean, they deal with everything, you know, in terms of COVID and everything perfectly. So there has been some really interesting developments in case law there around refugees and climate change. And in fact, they did have an acceptance of someone from one of the Pacific Islands in terms of a refugee claim. So there's some very interesting law there.
Yeah, thank you for reminding. New Zealand's almost annoyingly successful at this moment. Father Arriaga, I wanted to ask you a more general question about how asylum is framed in the United States, and maybe in some of the work that Maite has to do on a daily basis, and how that perception plays with regards to your advocacy in Latin America. Because in order to make a claim in the United States, at some level, one has to be making a claim about the conditions in the countries of origin. And so if we're talking about Mexico and Central America, the claims in the United States are fundamentally about, have to paint a picture of violence, lawlessness, right? Some form of inability to go there, go back. And so I'm curious if you would just speak to the Jesuit notion, that you've been speaking to about international law and the protection of people going to where they want to, with the more specific question of how Mexico and Latin American countries might have to be then framed for purposes of United States asylum law.
Yeah, it has been very difficult. Actually, I didn't speak about, we have also a project that is called the Jesuit Service of Migrants. And we have been working all over in Latin America with universities, and most of our universities here in Mexico and Latin America, they also have a human rights like clinic of migration. But remember, what is the category of a refugee? It's a person who has been persecuted for different reasons. One is race, second is religion, nationality, or a membership of a particular social group, or political opinions. So it must be outside the country of his nationality, and is unable to, owing to such fear, is unwilling to avail himself of the protection of that country. So that's the I think that's the definition of a refugee, right? So under that basis, there are different procedures that we could advocate a specific case. I remember when I was working at the Loyola Law School in Los Angeles for a while, we took a case of a refugee from Guinea. He was detained in El Salvador, in Ecuador, because he was traveling with a fake passport. So we took asylum case, I think it's called an NGO in Ecuador, who took the case. And then we took the case in the US as well. And we took the case before the UN as well. Finally, Canada was able to receive him. But I think the most important thing in this is to prove, to give evidence of such categories: nationality, race, member of a particular social group, or he was giving opinions. So that is sometimes is very difficult to prove, and especially if you come from what it's called a safe country. That's another category, right? And I think Maite knows more about that. So for example, in my case, when I was advocating for human rights in Mexico, I went to Canada, and in Canada, they were arguing, and as well as the United States, well, we don't have to receive people from Mexico because it's a safe country. What is the meaning of that safe country? It's very ambiguous, because we have lots of people who has been disappeared, judicial executions. I mean, there are a lot of violence in Mexico, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, all those countries. So sometimes it's very difficult, especially for women, because sometimes they're victims of domestic violence, and they don't want to receive people because they will say, no, it is not a political group. It's a particular, it is not valid to seek for refugee if you suffer domestic violence, but they do, because it's a lot of circumstances especially in small towns. Women have been raped or things like that. So yeah, it has been difficult, and for us, it's also, I mean, you have to take a Jesuit approach, and I think it's a matter of compassion as well, right? To be with the excluded and to seek for their rights as well. Thank you.
Maite, you had mentioned in one of your when your presentation, that one of the things you're seeing is the more general xenophobic, if you like, restrictionist, nationalistic rhetoric, which is rhetoric, right? But you were suggesting that you can see it actually filtering into decision making and into adjudicators at the point of, at the point of decision making for individuals. So I'm curious if you could just expand on that, how it is that you can see that, perhaps like in a tangible example of what that means to see this general sort of nationalistic, xenophobic rhetoric actually distill into immigration decisions.
Yeah. So into actual decisions, I don't know that I've ever had a judge. I shouldn't say that. I guess when we first had sort of a change of guard, they back in 2016, we did hear sort of there's a new sheriff in town sort of talk, but somebody actually on the record saying something, no, not necessarily. They could deny on a number of other things, or deny the thousands of pro se claims that go forward without an attorney being there. And you'll never maybe know their true motivation. But what I think you see is an unwillingness from ICE to exercise discretion when they can and release individuals. You see an unwillingness and a lack of professionalism from the Department of Homeland Security, who's my opposing counsel. You hear the people that are charged with the care of our clients saying awful things. And the clients honestly are predominant. They're just much too humble to repeat it a lot of the time. So the things that I have heard aren't even from clients necessarily, or if they were from clients, are repeated after some probing of like, hey, what's been going on, or what kind of treatment have you seen while you've been in detention. An example that comes to mind is somebody making a comment because there had been a number of outbreaks in the detention center, and my client wasn't being brought up because they were saying that he was cohorted, and it was not a COVID cohort. And I said, okay, I just need to get him these documents. They're time sensitive, so I need to get him these documents. Here they are. And the guard promptly tells me, I'm not your mail person, so figure it out. And then I walk off and I say, okay, thank you very much. And I go take my seat to wait for my next appointment. And I overhear the guard saying, if they could just keep their, diseases on their side of the border, we wouldn't have this situation. So comments like that. And this is an individual, again, who's responsible for caring for the client, who, is a guard at the detention center. And so things like that, I believe, while I'm not trying to pretend that didn't exist pre-2016, I think it emboldens this way of thinking and just invariably affects the way people act, and the level of respect and care that our clients get, and the due process. The judges are on the IJ level, meaning the immigration judge level. They have a Board of Immigration Appeal that has been stacked largely with conservative judges on purpose, and individuals that were pre this administration appointments are being told, why don't you go do something else, and being reassigned. So what does the judge on the first level, on the trial court level, have? What incentive do they have if they know up the chain who's checking them?
Thank you. Professor Kenny, you have the good fortune of living in a country where Donald Trump is not the president. But I'm curious if you could speak to Australian policy with regards to refugees, given what in general globally has been a nationalistic turn in the politics of several nations, not just the United States, but across Europe. You can see it in India and other places, and maybe some perspective on if Australian refugee law has shifted with those shifts, or has always been the same, or what should we make of the trends?
Yeah, sure. No, we don't have Donald Trump, but we do have a conservative government here, and some of the things that you've been talking about really resonate with me, and experiences that we see here around attitudes of Department of Home Affairs. So, for example, we had an election in 2013 where we shifted to a more conservative government, and that is when they did bring in this policy of intercepting and turning back boats. And the rhetoric around people coming in here illegally, we're being swamped. I mean, you must think it's a joke when we talk about the numbers we're talking about, but they said we're being swamped. We are an island, right? By people coming illegally, and terms like, people, they talked about people being terrorists. They talk about people having criminal records. We don't know who they are. So this sort of rhetoric was used very much, and was part of a very successful election policy. If you elect us, we'll stop the boats coming, and was a slogan that was used. And when that government came into power, we saw again, use of bringing in much more restrictive definitions around the definition of a refugee, because we don't have any Bill of Rights in Australia, so we can remove rights rather rapidly, so we can detain people indefinitely. And so we have some people who've been in immigration detention here for over 7 years. So we do see very similar rhetoric coming in here, unfortunately. I do think we did fundamentally have a good system, and aspects of that still exist, but it is being quickly eroded by continuing attacks. So if ever they see their popularity declining, then our current Minister of Home Affairs, so we used to be immigration, it's now adopted language of the United States and UK, and using Home Affairs. and bundling immigration in with security issues. Whereas it used to be about, you know, we're a country of immigrants, just like the United States. It used to be something that was celebrated and we're multicultural, but now it's been removed and we're home affairs and it's security and so on. And I think, unfortunately, during this time of the global pandemic, while Australia's really managed it fairly well, I can see our economy is declining, and I will bet that xenophobia and kicking migrants, and in particular refugees, will certainly be on the rise in the future, unfortunately.
Yeah, I don't know if you know this, but the United States is, I guess, officially not a nation of immigrants as of a few years ago, when it was taken off the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services website on their homepage, which was there for some time and is no longer. So I could keep asking questions of the panelists all day. I find this really fascinating. But if other people want to get in, I know, Vanjie, there was a question that was posed. I can't remember it now, but I think you had said you were going to provide an answer for it. So maybe you want to jump in, and if you have questions as well. So you're muted, Vanjie. Vanjie, you're still muted.
I think that was a mistake on my part, saying that I was going to answer it. Sorry.
Okay.
I believe that the question, I have the question, and maybe can sort of help read that one out loud, since it's disappeared for some reason. Basically, the question was actually to Father Arriaga, and it was, if the Jesuits are supporting refugees in Spain or other parts of Europe. Similarly, I think a question was about if you know of Jesuit opportunities for internships or advocacy volunteering. And then I would say part of this actually does go back to what Professor Abriel mentioned earlier about other opportunities for non-SU students. And I think Professor Abriel talked about the Center for Global Law and Policies. Maybe externships might help answer that, but just kind of some different opportunities for students that maybe either in or outside of SCU and interested in advocacy. And maybe Ms. Garcia might actually be able to address that as well.
And I'll just jump in for a second and say that we do have students, a number of students placed with the Jesuit Refugee Service in Malta. And I think we've also had some with the UNHCR in Geneva. So we don't have anything in Spain, but there are opportunities through our Global Law Center.
Yeah, I think right now, Fran Rivera is teaching in Geneva. I think so, right? During the summer. Yes, we do have that, and we have an office in Europe, in Belgium, and there's an email that if you see the webpage of the JRS, you can log into Jesuit Refugee Service in Belgium, and in Brussels there is an office, and you can send an email to that office. I think it's JRS Brussels .jrs.net. I think that's the email, because I check it right now. So there are a lot of opportunities to do internships and to do fellowships as well. Thanks.
Okay. Are there any other questions for the panelists? Let me ask just sort of a broad question. I mean, right now you are and this is for anyone, I'm curious about the perspective of any of the three panelists. You're seeing sort of the general trend towards restrictionism or nationalism, xenophobia, at the very moment that you have the most amount of refugees and displaced people and people running that there has ever been. This is an immovable object, right, and an unstoppable force. What's going to happen? I mean, what's the role of private organizations, of individuals? You know, is this something that ultimately will not be solved other than through, I guess, governmental action, or is this something that we can have interventions through private organizations, academic organizations, that actually makes a difference in this very large global problem? So we pose that $1 million question, and if anybody wants to take, yeah, go ahead, Father.
I just want to point out one thing that is very important, especially right now with the COVID-19 and all that. I think it's very important to say something, and we as advocates of human rights, I think we need to be very aware that we cannot give a green light to violate human rights under the excuse of security, right? Because they can take an argument of, I'm protecting your rights, therefore I'm violating human rights of the most vulnerable people, right? So that is happening in different parts of the world. So we have to be very aware of that. And remember that we cannot resign to our rights, because we have our rights that are part of our person as a human being. So we cannot say, oh, yeah, of course, you can violate more rights and more. We always, I mean, for example, I'm going to stop you because I need to review if you have something illegal in your car. I mean, that is a human right violation, right? So we have to be very aware of the obligation of the states with regards to political rights. So the state, remember, the states must refrain from interfering with or limiting the enjoyment of all human rights. So we have to be very aware of this context right now. Because, and of course, the people who will suffer the human rights violation will be migrants, refugees, and displaced people. And I think we need to protect that. Yeah, thank you.
Maite or Professor Kenny?
Oh yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I think that was an incredibly articulate response. I think that there is, you're perfectly right. I mean, we're at a stage where there's the most people displaced ever, and more countries are shutting down and tending to adopt the worst policies of each other. And I think that advocates, academics, or academic activists, as someone like Vandy and others, who are incredibly important in terms of, because you're looking at people, as Mate has talked about, who are very vulnerable. They have a lot to lose by speaking out. They are locked up, they are detained, they don't want to identify themselves, they have to accept that they have, you know, basically, while they're fleeing human rights abuse, they come to these countries and sometimes are subjected to even worse human rights abuses by the countries in which they're seeking asylum, and are extremely vulnerable and can't speak out for their rights. So I think advocates in this area are incredibly important. And I appreciate it's very depressing and difficult work. I'm doing some research at the moment where I'm interviewing lawyers in Australia around how do they manage and identify the distress of their clients. And this has huge impacts upon advocates, and they really do have to make sure that they're taking care of themselves in order to take care of other people. So it's something that really resonated with me, and some of the things that you've talked about, and I think is important to highlight.
Maite, last word to you.
Yeah, I think what everyone is saying very much resonates with me. I think because I'm on the ground, I often don't and cannot get caught up in the larger policy shift. I not to say that I'm just asleep on it, but I really try to focus what I can do as an individual. I think that also helps with my sanity a little bit, you know? So it's just a drop in the bucket, what I've been able to do. It's a drop of a drop of a drop in the bucket, but I can tell you it is incredibly meaningful to the people that I've helped and to the people that can now live their lives free, you know, as free as people of color can be in the United States, which is a whole other thing I won't get into, but you know, that's meaningful. And I think we all as advocates and as individual care really need to ask ourselves, what can we do and lean into that. So for me, it's this work on the ground, but for others, it might be taking a pro bono case. For another, it may be you have a sphere of influence, and so you're talking about these issues, you're educating yourself and educating others. I'm still maybe naively holding on to, if we're able to tell the stories of the people that are in this situation as much as possible, that we will educate the public about how this is a very important human issue and why everyone should care about it. I think, during family separation, that's the one time that I've seen it happen, at least during this administration, where people were like, like that really shocked the conscience. And I think we needed to keep doing that, because that was horrific, don't get me wrong, but what's happening now is as well. What's happened in MPP is as well. And so really, just when you hear these stories, repeating them and not allowing the rhetoric to just continue. So really, really doing our part to change that.
I think I should have stopped you at that after the first 3 sentences, because that was a very hopeful and optimistic note. But let's pretend that was the place where we stopped, and not the MPP part of it. But thank you all for participating and your comments. And I think that is actually a very appropriate place to leave the conversation for World Refugee Day. So thank you to you. Thank you to Professor Kenny. Thank you to Father Arriaga, Vanjie, for putting this together. Vanjie, I don't know if you want to say anything to take us out.
I wanted to thank Hallie, who really did the lion's share of organizing everything.
Thank you all. I'm so excited that we were able to do this, and thank you for our attendees. We will be sharing this video as well. We'll kind of clean it up a little bit and share it out. And thank you for everyone for joining us from around the world. This is so exciting.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good night.
Are you still on? Hey, Hallie, are you still on?
I am, yes.
That was fabulous.
I think so.
You did such a great job. It's like you've been doing this your whole life.
Oh, I don't know about that. I think we had some unexpected shifts, but I think it turned out. I think it turned out well.
I think so too. I think it was really meaningful. People said really meaningful things, and it was truly amazing to have people from 3 different countries.
I agree. I just think it was such that piece. I think I can't even.
Like chills in a way.
Yeah, that was really cool, and it was cool to hear their different perspectives on all the issues. I think I am gonna clean it up, but I think I'm gonna really push for people to watch it, because I think that it was really neat to see that piece, and I'm excited for Siming's presentation when once we set that date and all that. I think that this format's really neat.
And I bet he'll be very excited now that he's seen one go. I bet he'll be all gung ho to.
I think so too. I think it will kick us off, hopefully.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you.
Thank you
Hallie.
so much. Have a good
great job.
evening.
All right, you too. Bye.
Bye.